So how did we get here? I mean, how did humans get here on Earth? Now, some people believe that it was over millions and millions of years, and we just sort of came to be from a series of random events, that the Earth just happened to be this perfect distance from the sun to sustain life, that it was perfectly tilted on its axis to create the seasons, and that the gases in our atmosphere perfectly yet randomly aligned, and we moved and then slithered and then swam and then crawled and walked and grunted and then talked, all by random events. But others believe that there's a supreme being with a plan that set everything in motion that we see, that it was by his words and will that the universe was created, and that every human from conception to death is an image bearer of our holy creator God. There may be people watching today that are on both sides of those beliefs. But no matter what you believe, here's what it takes to believe what you do: faith. You either have faith that God did it all, or that God did not do it all and it just randomly happened. Both decisions require faith. Because we don't have videos that show what happened. Nobody was around to record it. So the only way to follow either of those two sets of beliefs is faith. Faith that you're believing in the right thing. Now, for most of us watching today, our faith is in God as the creator of life in the universe. And in this series, we're examining the faith of people in the Bible who made some big decisions based on faith. The big idea for this whole series is this: faith is acting in confident trust of God's character. You know, even when we don't understand, even when we're afraid, even when things aren't going the way we want, God's character can be trusted. Now, if you believe that, you are a person of faith, just like I am. And today we're going to look at a great example of two guys who trusted in God's character, even when everyone else around them doubted. Even when they were in the extreme minority, they still had faith. Faith in spite of what was going on around them, faith in spite of their own doubts and fears. They still had faith in God to do what he said he would do. Now, you've probably dealt with doubters in your life. We all have. It was in a 19th century Boston newspaper where the declaration was made that there was no need to ever transmit a human voice over wires. But still, in 1876, Alexander Graham Bell invented and successfully used his telephone. And I'm glad he didn't listen to the doubters. A little over a decade ago, in 2007, USA Today indicated that the iPhone wouldn't take off. I'm glad those doubters were wrong, because I enjoy mine, and you probably do too. If you're a person of faith, sooner or later, you're going to have to come up against doubters, or against big problems that might make you doubt. And when big problems are in front of us, doubt is lingering close by, ready to steal our faith at any time. And that's the case in the story we're looking at today. So if you have a Bible with you, wherever you are, we're going to be reading from the Old Testament books of Numbers and Joshua. Let me set the context for what we're about to read. The nation of Israel, also referred to as God's chosen people, had been in bondage for over 400 years in Egypt. We're going to pick up the story after that happened. But while they were in bondage, God raised up Moses to lead them out of slavery to a land God promised them called the Promised Land. And they were freed because God's power was on display for Pharaoh, the Egyptian leader, and for all to see. And when he saw God's power and he saw he couldn't win against God, Pharaoh let them go. And for 40 years, they lived as nomads in the desert, waiting for the land God promised them. This promise of a land of abundance, that kept them going. Moses, their leader, selects 12 men to go spy out the land and see what it's going to be like. It was a reconnaissance mission, so they would know what to expect. So listen to Numbers chapter 13 as all that happens. Moses gave these men instructions as he sent them out to explore the land. Go north through the Negev into the hill country. See what the land is like, and find out whether the people living there are strong or weak, few or many. See what kind of land they live in. Is it good or bad? Do their towns have walls, or are they unprotected like open camps? Is the soil fertile or poor? Are there many trees? Do your best to bring back samples of the crops you see. It happened to be the season for harvesting the first ripe grapes. When they came to the valley of a shoal, they cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes so large that it took 2 of them to carry it on a pole between them. They also brought back samples of pomegranates and figs. After exploring the land for 40 days, the men returned to Moses, Aaron, and the whole community of Israel at Kadesh in the wilderness of Paran. They reported to the whole community what they had seen and showed them the fruit they'd taken from the land. This was their report to Moses. We entered the land you sent us to explore, and it is indeed a bountiful country, a land flowing with milk and honey. Here is the kind of fruit it produces. So the explorers come back to say, this land is exactly what God promised. It's just like he said. But the story quickly turns from good news into bad news. Good news, it's perfect. But then others start speaking up and say, well, here's the bad news. But the people living there are powerful, and their towns are large and fortified. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. The Amalekites live in the Negev, and the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites live in the hill country. The Canaanites live along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, along the Jordan Valley. But Caleb tried to quiet the people as they stood before Moses. Let's go at once and take the land, he said. We can certainly conquer it. Now remember Caleb, because we're going to be talking about him again at the end of this message. Caleb was one of those spies who Moses sent out to scout the promised land. And here he is in a group of people who are panicked and disappointed and frustrated and confused. He doesn't hesitate with his seemingly stupid but no less confident plan. Let's take it. That's the kind of guy I want on my team. The kind of person that says, in spite of any obstacle you see, we can do this. Those attitudes are exciting to be around if you know people like that. But here's the response he got when he said, we can do this. We can take this land. But the other men who had explored the land with him disagreed. We can't go up against them. They're stronger than we are. So they spread this bad report about the land among the Israelites. The land we traveled through and explored will devour anyone who goes to live there. All the people we saw were huge. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers, and that's what they thought too. And now Caleb is at the place we often find ourselves, at a crossroads where we have to decide, am I going to listen to doubters or hold on to God's promises? The doubters weren't holding on to God's promises because they were saying, we can't do this. There's no way we can overcome these obstacles that are in front of us. But Caleb was different. Caleb was holding on to the promises of God. See, at the time this is happening, Caleb is probably around 47 years old. He had seen a lot. He would have been just a little boy when they left slavery in Egypt. He would have remembered God's faithfulness. He would have remembered that God provided a way out and God parted the Red Sea. He would have remembered God's guidance through the wilderness. He would have remembered God's daily provision of food for them. He could remember a history of God doing exactly what God said he would do. And that raised his confidence enough to say, we've got this. We can conquer this land. And at this point, the spies and the people were split into 2 groups. Those who were filled with fear and doubt, and those confident in the promises of God. There were 10 of them looking at all the negative things, all the things to be afraid of. I mean, giants are scary. And when they saw the strength of their enemy, they forgot about the strength of God. And that's easy for us to do too. A strong enemy can cause us to forget our all-powerful, all-loving God. Ask yourself this question. When fear creeps into my life, where do I tend to focus? On the problems around me or the promises God has for me? So the 10 spies who were focusing on the problems go back to the community and do something that's still common today. They spread worry and fear. Worry and fear tend to be contagious because the people had 2 voices in front of them. One voice saying, we can't win. And then 2 guys saying, we can't lose. The worry, the fear, the negativity of the 10 spread just like it does today, and the negative voice of "we can't win" became the loudest voice. And here's what happened next. It says in verse 14, "Then the whole country began weeping aloud and cried all night. Their voices rose in a great chorus of protest against Moses and Aaron. 'If only we had died in Egypt or even here in the wilderness,' they complained. 'Why is the Lord taking us to this country only to have us die in battle? Our wives and our little ones will be carried off as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to return to Egypt?' They plotted among themselves, 'Let's choose a new leader and go back to Egypt.'" So what's happening here is fear of their problems turned inward. And suddenly they had more faith in their enemy to defeat them than they had in God to deliver them. And the same thing happens to us today. Bad things happen. We see it. We scroll through our news feed totally unaware that much of the worldview today is simply there to divide us, to fill us with fear. And we can find ourselves having more faith in what divides us than God's power to unite us. The people of Israel were so focused on their problems, they were willing to go back to bondage to escape them. But two men, Caleb and Joshua, were different. See, out of the 12 spies, 10 said, "We can't do this. We can't win." 2 said, "We can't lose." While they recognized their problems, they didn't ignore them, but their faith was greater in God's promises to deliver them. So finally, they speak up. And here's what they said. They said to all the people of Israel, this is Joshua and Caleb, "The land we traveled through and explored is a wonderful land. And if the Lord is pleased with us, He will bring us safely into that land and give it to us. It's a rich land flowing with milk and honey. Do not rebel against the Lord, and don't be afraid of the people of the land. They are only helpless prey to us. They have no protection, but the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid of them." So here are the Israelites, the entire nation, wishing they were already dead and wanting to go overthrow their leaders and go back to Egypt. And Caleb and his friend Joshua say something that's really key in verse 8 when they said, "If the Lord is pleased with us, He will bring us safely into that land and give it to us." And what Caleb and Joshua were really saying is this: if we have faith in God, if we believe in His promises, He will make a way. Because we can see throughout the Bible that the faith of God pleases God. Moses sent out 12 spies. Only 2 had faith. Listen to this. When you're living your life, trying to be a person of faith, living that out day to day, you're going to have to realize that faith will put you in the minority. The majority may be focusing on the problems, but we need to be focusing on God's promises. And that brings us to our big idea for our message today. Faith focuses on God's promises instead of my problems. See, God isn't looking for perfect people. He's looking for faithful people. And aren't you thankful He's not looking for perfection? Because I fall short and you fall short. He's looking for faithfulness. Faithful people please God. I love this story because we get to see how it ends. From everything I just read, we're going to fast forward about 40 years into the future. Their leader Moses had died, and he passed the leadership baton to Joshua, and Joshua and Caleb lead the nation in battle in taking the land that God had promised them. Now, there's a lot of other specifics to this story, but I want to focus on the results of living a lifetime of faith. Because we started with these 2 men, Joshua and Caleb, young men in their mid to late 40s. What would that be like if you lived an entire life trusting in the promises of God? Well, the results of focusing on God's promises instead of our problems, we know what happened at the end of Caleb's life. We're going to pick up near the end of Caleb's life in the book of Joshua, chapter 14, where it says this. This is Caleb speaking to Joshua after they have moved into the promised land. They're living there. They still have some battles to fight, But here's what these two now old men are talking about. Caleb says this: "Now, as you can see, the Lord has kept me alive and well, as he promised, for these 45 years since Moses made this promise, even while Israel wandered in the wilderness. Today, I'm 85 years old." So this is an 85-year-old man talking. "I am as strong now as I was when Moses sent me on that journey, and I can still travel and fight as well as I could then. So give me the hill country that the Lord promised me. You will remember that as scouts, we found the descendants of Anak living there in great walled towns. But if the Lord is with me, I will drive them out just as the Lord had said." So Joshua blessed Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and gave Hebron to him as his portion of the land. Hebron still belongs to the descendants of Caleb, son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, because he wholeheartedly followed the Lord, the God of Israel. There's a lot of wisdom spoken by Caleb here, and also a lot of names that are hard to pronounce. Even though about 40 years have passed since he explored the land, since we started reading the story, Caleb is still trusting in God's timing and God's promises. He knew that God's promises don't have an expiration date. His faith has not wavered. He knew faith focuses on God's promises instead of my problems. And apparently, a lifetime of faith can make an 85-year-old man feel like he can fight like a 45-year-old man. So today, I'm asking you to get in the minority, to transfer your faith away from the problems around you and in front of you to the promises God has for you. Now, that might seem impossible, and I get that, because life can throw all kinds of problems our way, and we can get ourselves in a mess sometimes. So jumping into faith instead of our problems can sometimes seem impossible. Well, if you feel like that, you're not alone. Even Jesus' own disciples asked the same question. If you expect us to have faith, how does this work? Because one day there was this person who came up to Jesus, and his disciples would have been watching this, and he asked Jesus, "How do I have eternal life?" And essentially what Jesus says to him is this: "Have faith in me and nothing else." It was such a challenge that the young man walked away from Jesus and chose to reject eternal life. And that caused the disciples to look at Jesus and think, well, if this person left, if they can't be saved, then who can be saved, Jesus? And Jesus responds with this powerful statement in the book of Mark, chapter 10, where he said this: "Jesus looked at them intently and said, 'Humanly speaking, it is impossible, but not with God. Everything is possible with God.'" He wanted them to know that when life makes things seem impossible from a human perspective, he wants them to know from God's perspective, they're possible. See, we need to have faith that with God, it is possible that relationship that looks like it's going to go down can be turned around, that the addiction can be broken, that forgiveness can be asked for and received, that step of faith will lead you to a better place in life. It's possible that the friend you're praying for, or the friend that you think there's no way they would ever say yes to Jesus, with God, it's possible. Or it's possible that the problem you're facing can pale in comparison to the life that God has for you. And if you never started your journey of faith in Christ, please click on the prayer tab if you're watching at one of our moderated times, or let us know in the chat if you would like to talk. And if you're watching on demand, just contact us. Whatever the case, we'll get back with you and we'll guide you through your decision on what it means to start following Jesus so you can live with a faith in God's promises instead of faith in the problems around you. And for those of you who follow Christ and need a reminder to refocus on the promises God has made to you instead of the loud voices of problems and doubt around you, I pray this message has been a reminder to live with the peace that everything is possible with God. It's even possible to get through what you're trying to get through right now with faith in God. May you live a faith that focuses on God's promises instead of your problems.